Hello, this is Fritz-Ay Says, and welcome back to One Last Night. So this is going to be episode 2, and we just got saved from a faded by a mysterious archer. Let's go ahead and begin. And then I blacked out. Dear Marshall, I read online somewhere that keeping a journal is a good way to process your emotions. As cheesy as it sounds, like how much I miss you. Amongst other things, of course. Can't be thinking of you all the time now, can I? Why am I trying to justify myself to a book? Yes, this is mostly to help me get through the time spent without you when I'm in the apartment alone. I know it's only for a couple of hours, but this place feels a bit empty when you're gone. Your presence is so comforting that when it's not there, I feel like a small piece of myself is missing with it. We've been dating for little over a year and a half now, and already have an apartment together. For most, it would seem too fast, but with you, Marshall, it feels just right. I never really knew just how good love could feel until I met you. And yet, it's still surprising in a lot of ways. I've only just started to realize how much I rely on you. Whether it's to be there when I'm hurting, or even just to have someone whose tail wags vigorously when eating my cooking, I've come to rely on that sense of joy that accompanies you. It helps me get through the days, especially the darker ones. At this point, I'm not sure what I'd do without you. I'll always patiently await your return as well, waiting near the door as the hours come to a close, as if I were the dog in this relationship. Yeah, I'm definitely not letting you see this journal. It feels a bit silly to be writing all this down. Keeping a catalog of my daily thoughts and emotions as if they'd be important later. At the same time, though, I can't deny it is oddly comforting to have this to be able to look back at someday. I'm sure it'll provide me with some good laughs as time goes on. Aside from that, though, when you get home tonight, it'll mark the start of the weekend. Which means I'll have several days with you to myself. Well, I think that'll do for a first entry for now. See you soon, my wolf. Love, Dorian. Pain. That's the first feeling that overwhelms me as my mind begins to drift back towards consciousness. I feel the ache spread through my entire body, the soreness most concentrated towards my shoulder. It feels as though I've been run over by a small semi-truck. An involuntary groan escapes my lips as I begin to try and sit up, removing the blanket covering me. I have a bit of trouble trying to move my left arm for whatever reason, so I rely mostly on my right to move me into a seated position. Looking down, the arm is in some kind of makeshift sling strung across my chest. Shit, what happened? My voice comes out slightly raspy and hurts my throat. I take a moment then to actually look myself over, finding more than just the sling wrapped up. I'm covered in bandages. Scattered across my arms, legs, and torso, most of my clothing has been removed, save for my underwear. For as sore as I am, I can still tell that all this dressing is overkill, and I know for a fact I didn't have this much first aid with me on my last inventory check. Which means somebody must have dressed my wounds, and were definitely overly cautious when doing so. But who? There's a flash through my mind at that, as it races to catch up with my missing memories from earlier in the day. I fought a faded, and almost lost to it had I not received help from that figure I saw before I blacked out. Were they the one that helped me? As if on cue, there's a shuffling sound from outside, and that familiar silhouette steps through the tent flaps. Deep breaths. I'm sure he's just Oh! Staring down at me is a tall, lanky bat, frozen in place at the sight of my now conscious form. His face almost seems to be wearing a mask, black fur covering it in contrast to the brown fur on the rest of his body. A body I can get a good view of due to his odd fashion choices. On his torso, he wears a black crop top. Room left at the sides for his wings, but leaving his midriff exposed. Slung across his back is a quiver full of arrows, presumably the same ones that had shot the Fated earlier. His legs are covered by a pair of jeans, ripped and fading beyond belief. To accentuate all this, he wears a tattered light pink scarf draped across his shoulders.
You're awake! Oh, thank God you're awake. I was so worried I had messed something up.
He takes a step towards me, causing me to reach for my spear on instinct. Forgetting for the fact that my arm is in a sling, I jerk to the side and throw myself off balance, resulting in me falling onto my shoulder. A startled yelp escapes my lips on the suddenness of the impact. The bat rushes toward me, dropping the bow he was holding and reaching out with his hands. I try and wriggle away, but I feel him grab me and bring me into a sitting position once more.
Easy there. You're still hurt.
He sits across from me once I've stabilized, but I glare at him with a look of distrust. He may have helped me, but I still don't know what his intentions were. I try to ask him where my spear is, but a cough comes out instead, the result of my dry throat. He reaches to his side and removes a canteen, unscrewing the cap and holding it out towards me. My hand begins to move upward, but I hesitate. Even though I want to immediately grab the water, I err on the side of caution. I have no way of knowing whether the liquid is safe to drink or not. Seeing this, the stranger brings the canteen to his own lips and takes an audible drink, a bit of water dribbling out the side of his mouth.
See? Perfectly safe. I promise I'm friendly.
Holding out the canteen again, I hesitate for only a second before grabbing it, hungrily gulping down the water. I gasp in relief as I come up for air, feeling satisfied with the moisture now returned to my mouth. A pleased look crosses the face of the bat, one that simply seems to be genuinely happy that I'm okay. It catches me off guard, seeing that level of purity in his eyes. It's something I haven't seen in so long, likely not since our world began to fracture. I feel the walls I had built up lower a bit at that, a part of me wanting to trust him. Curiosity bubbles up inside me, wanting to know more. Clearing my throat, I find my voice again. I appreciate the help, but I don't believe I've caught your name while I was asleep. He blinks a few times, processing that, his cheeks flush in embarrassment as he realizes he hadn't introduced himself yet.
Oh, right. Of course. How could I forget? My name's Xavier. What's yours?
Dorian. His smile widens at that.
A pleasure to meet you, Dorian. How are you feeling, by the way? I did my best to patch you up, but I don't really have a lot of experience with first aid.
I take the time now to remove my arm from the sling, stretching out a bit to get a feel for whatever damage Xavier had thought I had taken. Aside from the soreness, it didn't feel all too bad. The pain I'd felt when I'd woke up earlier nearly non-existent. All things considered, I think I'm fine, though all the bandages seem to be overkill. I gesture to my near mummified body to accentuate my point. He lets out a small laugh at that and rubs the back of his neck.
Yeah, not my finest work. Let me help redo them, but this time you can take the lead.
While I'd usually never let someone I just met get this close to me, I don't really have much of a choice. For now, I'll have to rely on him a bit. Keep him close until I have more information. To our surprise, we found very few cuts on my body. I'd expect at least some reason for his overreaction, but the bruises would be the only reason for that, and even then, it's not good enough. Although that doesn't quite explain his surprise, as if reading my mind, he starts speaking.
I swear, you looked a lot worse when I found you. You were completely covered in scratches, and I could see the bruising starting. Your shoulder had even been dislocated. I put it back in place while you slept.
That explained the soreness in that area. I give him a reassuring pat before I started to get dressed, my body no longer heavily wrapped. No need to worry so much about it. Better to overdo it than underdo it when it comes to things like these. I'm sure you were just scared after fighting the Fated. He stares at me with confusion stretched across his features.
You mean the big monster thing?
I let out a laugh at that. I suppose that's one term for it, yes. Most just call them Fated, though. Something that looked like hope sparked behind his eyes.
There are others. More survivors like us?
Of course there are. He seems overjoyed at that, as if it were the best news he'd ever received. It had been a year since the start of the apocalypse. There's no way he hadn't encountered anybody else in that time. I knew something was off about Xavier, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. I looked at him again, thinking over my options. Although I'd been somewhat injured from the last fight, from what I could tell his main weapon was a bow. A long-range fighter in close quarters was at an obvious disadvantage. I definitely had more muscle than him. He had some definition in his arms, but I was confident I could beat him in a fight if it came down to it. With that assessment out of the way, I was determined to get my answers. Who are you? Now it was his turn to be caught off guard.
I'm Xavier, remember? I know you said you were fine, but maybe you really did hit your head hard.
I brush off his hand as he tries to reach toward me, concerned. No, that's not what I meant. I was asking who you are, as in what's your story? How can you be so upbeat and innocent after all that's happened? How can you not know what a Fated is, or that there are other survivors after a full year? I'll ask you again, Xavier. Who are you? Xavier shifted at that, seemingly uncomfortable with my questions.
Well,
His squirming was starting to annoy me, but I kept myself in check, even reining the earlier attitude back a bit, thinking about how the questions sounded. The best ways to get answers out of someone like him was to be kind but direct. Besides, after seeing his bow skills earlier, he'd likely be a better as an ally than an enemy. Take a deep breath, kid. You already have my respect for saving me from that Fated. You don't have to be afraid to tell me what happened to you. Taking a moment, the bat begins to compose himself before speaking once more.
It's not that I'm afraid to tell you. It's just something I'd rather not relive.
I felt a pang of sympathy at that, knowing the sensation all too well. You can keep the details scarce then. Just tell me what you can. It'll help the both of us. He took another deep breath before continuing.
Simple. I can do simple. This will sound wild, but hear me out. When whatever happened, I was in a bunker.
I blinked a few times, processing his words. A bunker?
Yes. My parents were unique in their beliefs, let's say. We had a bunker as if it was a normal thing. Bunker cleaning was amongst my chores. I was down there when everything above ground happened. I tried to get out, but the hatch mechanism had been damaged. So I was stuck down there alone for, based on what I think you said earlier, nearly a year.
A year? A full year stuck alone with no view of the outside world. I understand now why you didn't want to talk about it. That would have been its own kind of hell. How do you manage to stay sane so long? I hadn't the slightest clue. It also explained why he had so little knowledge of everything going on out here. I had so many questions I wanted to ask, but I should get him to trust me more before I try to pry deeper. Still, there was something I had to know. How did you get out? A sad smile was on his face, something that made me feel guilty comparing it to what I had seen from him earlier. And while what he'd shown earlier was genuine, it was clear now that there was a lot more going on under the surface.
As it turns out, the foundation hadn't been structurally stable as I thought. Water had worn away at one of the walls, causing it to break suddenly and the bunker to flood. I grabbed what I could and took one last breath before I swam for the surface. I'm not sure how long ago that was. Maybe 3 days? It's hard to keep track of time with whatever is going on with the sky.
A silence settled over us at that, me taking in everything I'd just been told while Xavier relived the painful memories once again. Xavier was the first to break it.
So, why'd you call me kid earlier?
I tried to hold in a grin at that obvious subject change. It was clear he wanted to lighten the mood, and I was more than willing to play along.
Well, because you're a kid. How am I a kid?
Just from looking at you in comparison to myself, it's clear I have years on you.
You look to be as old as I am. How old are you then?
25. He looked at me bewildered.
25? I'm 22. That's only a difference of 3 years. You're barely older and definitely not old enough to be calling me kid.
I imitated a look of fake shock, bringing my hand to my chest. Now, come on, kid. Is that any way to be speaking to your elders? We stared at each other for a few moments before we both burst out laughing, the tension of the moment now broken thanks to Xavier. It had been a while since I laughed like this, let alone gotten along this well with somebody so fast. I know, though, that could only last so long. Our laughter began to die down. I could see that Xavier was getting ready to ask me something else.
Okay, so I answered some of your questions, but I still have plenty of my own. The world is so different now compared to before.
I nodded at him, knowing where this was going. Don't have to tell me twice. I've lived through it. Fair is fair, though. You deserve to know what's happening. So, what do you want to know? Given that he had next to no knowledge of this new age, I'm sure he had a multitude of questions. There were very few similarities that remained over the past year, with a lot of them having no proper explanation either. All I could do was try to answer his questions with what I'd seen or heard. A small sense of dread crept up my spine, as if it knew whatever the next question would be, I wouldn't like it.
Well, how about when it all started? What was it like?
That confirmed the sensation. He really had wasted no time diving immediately into the hard-hitting questions. I suppose there was something to be admired in that, though. The avoidance of unnecessary topics. I thought back to that day, giving an involuntary shudder at the memory. Are you sure you want to know that first? It's not exactly lighthearted stuff.
If I didn't think I could handle it, I wouldn't have asked. I have a year to catch up on. I need to have some knowledge of everything.
The determination in his voice told me I wasn't getting out of this, and it was only fair that I tell him something in return. A trauma for a trauma, I suppose. I closed my eyes as I allowed the waves of memories to wash over me. It was ordinary that day when it first started. Everyone was going about their usual morning habits. I was in my apartment, the clock having struck noon a little while prior. I changed clothes so that I could make a trip to the store. I had planned on making an assortment of baked goods.
What kind?
I felt a smile on my face at that question. Cookies, tarts, an assortment of muffins. Just a variety of delicacies. Marshall's sweet tooth was never satisfied, so I wanted to make sure I had enough to last. I was going over my list and double-checking I had everything. My reusable bags hanging from my arm when it started. I never experienced an earthquake before, and neither had most people who live here, so I was confused. Of course, we read about them in school, but I was surprised to feel one. The tremors were gentle at first, rattling the objects on the shelves of my living room. I held onto the table while I waited for it to pass. But it didn't. Instead, the tremors grew more violent. I made my way to the living room on unsteady feet, hoping to catch a glimpse of the chaos outside. And chaotic it was. I could see other buildings shaking as well, cracks appearing in the pavement on the street below. People everywhere were stunned, unsure of what to make of themselves as the earthquake worsened. Suddenly, fractures began to creep up the walls of the nearby building. Our infrastructure wasn't well equipped for a situation like this. A cloud of dust puffed out the sides as the floor collapsed onto itself, causing the top half to lean and crash into another skyscraper nearby. That is what finally broke people from their stupor. I could see the chaos breaking in the street below as people began to flee, those in their cars trying to avoid crashing as debris rained down from above. I couldn't let myself die here, though, so I forced my gaze away and began to gather a few things I knew the locations of. Running to my room, I took out my hiking pack from the closet, throwing in an extra outfit just in case. I grabbed my journals as well as a few mementos that were important to me. Lastly, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and a pack of matches. I didn't know what was happening and I wanted to be prepared for anything. I took a look at my home once more, something telling me this would likely be the last I saw of it. My gaze then settled on the window outside. A complex from across the street was now falling victim to the quakes as well, and it seemed to be leaning in our direction. Wasting no more time, I flung the door open, dashing to the stairs and throwing myself down them. Although living high up had given me the advantage of a view, the negative side of that being that I had to descend many flights of stairs in such a brief period of time. I passed a few people who were also fleeing, holding what little belongings they could manage. I reached the bottom of the stairwell and held the door open, ushering the people out when I heard the impact from high above. The last person stumbled out the door, a young feline man around my age. I grabbed them before they could fall, and the two of us dashing across the lobby to get outside. The people ahead of us had already left, not bothering to wait around. With each moment that passed, the crashing grew louder as the building was collapsing. Holding my bag in front of us, I didn't bother trying for the door handle, instead using the force of our combined weight to shatter the glass and send us onto the street. We rolled across the pavement just in time, a concussive blast of air sending us hurtling further and faster as the building finished collapsing in itself. I was left coughing and stunned, my ears ringing from it all. It was disorienting, but I knew I couldn't stop. Hoping the man was alright and doing the same, I began to run. I wasn't sure where I was going, instead letting my body take me wherever it wanted to go. However, as I fled, there seemed to be some kind of energy in the air. It began to build before it went out in a pulse. Cars stopped running, lights flickered before going out completely. An airplane high in the sky above began hurtling towards the ground below. Not letting it stop me, I ran. I ran and ran until I was heaving and my legs had long pushed past their limit. When I eventually collapsed from the exhaustion, I found myself on the outskirts of town near a forest I had often hiked through, a place I was familiar with. The sky had changed too, now decorated with hues of twilight way too early. After a few minutes I sat up, taking a look at the city from afar. If I hadn't lived there my whole life, I'm not sure I would have recognized what it had become. Now it was a smattering of broken buildings, light reflecting off the shattered glass. I could only sit there and stare, not knowing how many lives had been lost or what my next steps would be. That's what it was like in the beginning. I opened my eyes again, seeing the familiarity of the inside of my tent and bringing a hand to my face, wiping the few tears that had fallen during the retelling. I looked over to Xavier, who wouldn't meet my gaze, likely ashamed of me having to recap my trauma and comparing it to his own.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize how rough it must have been for you. I never should have,
I cut him off with a wave of my hand. It's fine, and I'm fine. Everyone has their own story to tell, and it's only fair that I share mine with you after everything. Silence once again passed over us as I waited for the next question, allowing both of us a few moments of respite.
I guess it's true what they say.
About what?
People never judge a book by its cover, as the phrase goes. I don't think either of us could have expected what the other was going to say.
I doubt we even expected them to be our reality. Sure, some believed in the eventual end of the world, but nobody could have known that we'd actually be living it. Xavier gave me a small nod, as if waiting for me to continue. And I agree with you. Everyone has their own life. It's impossible to tell what's truly going on beneath the surface at just a simple glance. We both just proved that fact to each other. With the way things are, everyone has suffered their own trauma. How they let it affect them is what matters. Did they succumb to it, giving in to the darker intentions? Or did they use it as a boost to grow stronger, to help them move forward and assist those around them? That's the kind of world we've always lived in, but the effects are now increased tenfold. After pondering my words for a few moments, Xavier speaks up.
I choose to believe that no matter what, there is always a way to recover. Everyone has the ability to improve themselves for the better. It may be the harder route sometimes, but they'll get there one day, even if they need that extra push. Nobody is inherently good nor evil. It's the life they led that shapes them. Sometimes you just have to help them reach a better mold. This world may be broken now, but maybe one day it can be fixed. I hope to be on the side that makes it all okay again.
I stared at Xavier, sharing a soft smile with him. He was a lot more insightful than I originally gave him credit for, and it was nice to see his optimism shine through. Everyone could use a little more of that kind of outlook, myself included. I hope to be there with you too, kid. For now, though, anything else you want to ask?
Just one more question, as I'm sure I won't like the answer either, and I'll need some time to process everything you've told me. What is that monster we fought? I think you called it something that started with an F?
The Faded. He snapped and shot me finger guns.
That's the one.
Well, he was right about the first part. The answer wasn't something he'd like, and wasn't one I liked either. This is another heavy one, so I suggest you steel yourself. As always, there isn't a full explanation I can provide, but there are some things I can tell you for certain. Are you ready? Xavier took a moment before nodding the go-ahead. To keep it simple, the Faded are people. Or at least they used to be. It's another cruel effect from the apocalypse. A few weeks after the initial incident, everyone was waiting for some kind of help. There were many injured hoping to be treated, others trying to find lost family. They waited and waited, but after a while it started to become clear no help was coming. It was at that point that the first Faded emerged. A small encampment of survivors had gathered together, hoping that somehow they'd find a savior amongst them. Instead, they were met with the gurgle of their own blood, choking out their prayers as a creature slashed at their throats. More began to appear after that, seemingly out of nowhere. It wasn't until two friends were together that the change was first witnessed. One of them had watched their partner die before them a few days prior, and it broke them. The friend tried comforting her, but she was too lost in her own grief. They woke up in the night to see their grieving friend beginning to change, taking on a more monstrous form and an insatiable bloodlust. They tried calling out to her, but it was too late, their voice landing on deaf ears. That's why we call them the Faded. They're nothing more than husks of their former selves, losing all aspects that once gave them heart. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes, each with their own defining traits and displaying varying levels of intelligence. It's rare that you will find two of the same kind, however, which is both a blessing and a curse. No matter what, though, it's best to avoid them at all costs. We were lucky to have made it out alive today. Most share a worse fate. I took my gaze off my feet and back to Xavier, who was staring at his own now. It wasn't something easy to learn about. I even had trouble believing it when I first heard it. What hurt most was the fact that we had killed something that had once been a person. Someone like us. I crawled my way over to his side of the tent, draping an arm across his shoulders. I probably could have spared some of the gorier details, but it was important that he knew what he was up against, what these creatures really were, and what they were capable of. He leaned in towards me, needing this much more than I did. I no longer had any suspicions that he had been faking anything he told me. Xavier would need an ally in this world, someone he could trust. Right now, I had to be that person for him. As we sat there, I could feel exhaustion pulling at me once more, my body not quite done with its recovery despite having slept several hours. It occurred to me that I hadn't actually checked what time it was. I reached over to my pack and began to rummage around inside it, searching for the item I was after. It took a few moments before I found it, a small golden pocket watch I removed from my pack and began to turn it over in my hands. Flipping it open, I could see the small hand pointing towards the 6 and the minute hand a quarter past the 12. That meant I had been out for nearly 7 hours now. No wonder Xavier had been worried about me. Before closing it, I run my thumb across our engraved initials inside, the emotions beginning to bubble up. It was a gift from Marshall that he'd given me for my last birthday before the apocalypse. I smile at the memory. I told him not to get me anything that year, but my wolf always liked to rebel against things like that. I'll never forget the line he said when he gave it to me, one that was corny as hell. To help you keep track of all the time spent lost in my eyes. There was a small pang in my heart at that, but I closed the pocket watch and returned my attention back towards my companion. Alright, I think that's enough for now. I have a few things to do, but I would appreciate it if you got a head start on that fire for us. Think you can manage that? He gave me a small nod of acknowledgement, remaining seated. I went back over to my pack and grabbed a few things I need, taking the fire starting supplies and leaving them next to Xavier. Whenever you're ready. Opening the flaps of the tent, I was now able to get a view of the aftermath of the fight. Scattered debris aside, the place seemed relatively the same, the only signs of fighting now being the dried black blood that coated the ground. As I'd seen a glimpse of earlier, the site was now illuminated by the dull glow of the twilight sky. The remaining rays of warm light were just bright enough that I could move on to the task at hand. There were bodies that needed to be investigated. I made my way over to the faded first, the now unmistakable reek of death overpowering my nose the closer I got. Opening one of my journals, I started my inspection of the corpse. No recent additional external damage seemed to present itself that wasn't resulting from our fight. However, there were a few scars across its body that had long since healed. Just those facts alone already told me some things. The first was that this had been an older faded. Not one that had been around since the start, but not a fresh victim to the transformation either. The second was that we clearly had not been its first quarry. There was no telling just how many it had killed during its reign, but at least some had a fighting chance. Lastly, the creature had not fed in a while. Pairing the lack of prior wounds to the fragile state it seemed to be in, skin tight around the elongated bones, gave me the picture that this fight with us had been out of desperation and greed. There was still more info I needed to glean before I could establish a proper theory, so I continued my investigation. Nothing else seemed to be out of the ordinary, and I was about to move when I noticed a splash of color near its mouth. Red. Leaning in closer, I could make out traces of blood near its two fangs I'd seen earlier. Making a mental note of that, I walked over to my next task. As I approached the second body, the stench of death began to lessen. In fact, there was barely a trace of it coming from the polar bear. I was now able to get a better look at the man since the impending threat had been reduced to a rotting mound. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, clothes and fur covered in a layer of grime he'd likely picked up from traveling. From the way his clothes hung off him, he could easily have been written off as skinny. However, it seemed as though his fur was unnaturally baggy as well, despite it having a healthy sheen. The tree branch he was impaled on had a distinct lack of blood on it. Only a few trickles dried into the wood. This was definitely a secondary wound, one received after death. Moving the body off the branch, it took me only a few seconds to find what I had been looking for. Bingo. On the back of his neck were 2 puncture marks, the clothing just below it having soaked up a bit of blood. Just as I thought, the creature had bitten him and sucked the moisture from his body. The missing fluids explained why he looked deflated and lacked the smell of rot, the bacteria having a harder time feasting on the dried flesh. The pieces of the puzzle had now fallen into place. The fated don't have a tendency to venture out this far usually, preferring to remain in the ruins that was once a thriving city. It had either struggled to find life or had been driven out of its territory by another of its kind. Starving, it had made its way out here on a whim. Enter that creature's stroke of luck where that polar bear appeared. Sneaking up on the unsuspecting victim, the monster seized the opportunity and bit down, draining the hydration from the man. Then nearby it spotted my camp. It must have believed today was a miracle, the possibility of more food driving its greed. It laid the trap then, placing the polar bear against a tree and triggering the alarm. Whether on purpose or by accident, I couldn't know. It waited in the shadows then, overconfidence dousing its corrupt mind as it hoped to play with its food. Unfortunately for it, there had been 2 of us and we gained the upper hand. I couldn't possibly know how much of my assessment had been accurate, but it helped me process it all, making it easier to handle as if I were a TV detective. It allowed me a sliver of separation from reality, something much needed. There was still one question on my mind, though, and that was why the man was nearby in the first place. Searching the body, I began to rifle through his pockets for a clue about his identity. They were mostly empty, aside from a few basic survival items, like a pocket knife. Opening his jacket led me to what I was looking for. Sewn in just below the collar with a golden thread was the symbol of a house with its door open, something I recognized. The symbol of Haven. It took about 2 hours and was relatively shallow, but I managed to dig a grave for the fallen bear. Although I didn't know him, he still deserved as best a burial as I could give him. I had taken a moment to cut the symbol out of his jacket, deeming that it would be useful later on. The sun had finally vanished from the sky, leaving most things lit by the moon. The campsite, however, was embraced by the warm light of a fire, successfully lit by Xavier, who was seated nearby. I walked over and sat next to him quietly. He seemed to be doing better now, but there was more of a weight on his shoulders, the invisible burden of the newfound knowledge dragging at him a bit. How are you holding up? I know you've got a lot on your mind after today. His gaze was focused on the flames as they licked at the air hungrily, the crackle of burning wood accompanying the sight.
Better than I thought it would be. I still have a lot of questions, but I appreciate the straightforwardness. There's a comfort in knowing what awaits me out there than remaining oblivious. Thank you for that.
I smiled softly at him, happy to hear it. In a lot of cases, people will shield others from the horrors of the world, leaving them not knowing what to do when they come face to face with them. It's better you knew when he did than to have him unprepared for later.
This world is so much different now. Something I can tell even though I haven't been above ground long. It's surprising just how much can change in a year.
The same could be said before all this happened, though. With the way the world was going, all the new technological advancements, creativity higher than it had ever been, and interesting scientific discoveries. Each year you could reflect on the previous one and be shocked at the comparison. Society had really come far. Xavier cringes slightly at that.
That's a good point, I guess. Though it still hurts to have to describe it in the past tense now.
I gave a sigh, empathizing with the poor boy. I'm not sure that's something that will ever get easier. A small smile formed on Xavier's muzzle.
Doesn't mean we can't get back there one day. It's as if the world had been given a second chance. Society has a fresh start to build something new. Things may be difficult right now, but there's always a brighter dawn when the night ends. It's our job to make sure we part the clouds that block the way, so we really get a chance to shine.
My heart warmed a little at his words, knowing that despite what he learned today, he could still hold on to that sense of optimism. I felt myself growing in that same smile he was wearing, as positively almost infectious. And positivity was something I could use more of in my strange new life. I bumped my shoulder against his, widening my smile. Careful now, Xavier. Keep talking like that and I might mistake you for a hippie. We both let out a chuckle at the joke, feeling some of the good vibes starting to return.
Speaking of night, mind if I ask some more questions, Dorian?
I nodded, sensing where the conversation was headed. Hit me with them, kid. He rolled his eyes at being called a kid once more, but continued.
What exactly is the deal with the whole daylight cycle? It seemed to be twilight for an awfully long time earlier, and it feels too early to be night. I mean, we barely even got any proper sunshine.
I took a moment to ponder his question, thinking of the best information that I could provide him that wouldn't ruin the ongoing mood. There's not a clear answer to that since we don't have access to the proper tech to figure it out. However, everyone has their own theories. The crazier ones often say it's the work of a coven of witches finally enacting a centuries-long curse, or that the government shrank the sun. The more believable theories state that something caused the Earth to shift and knock it off its axis. The new rotation causes us to spend more of our time in a state of twilight. He seems to contemplate for a moment before nodding as if he decided on something.
I think the witches theory is more fun, so I'll go along with that.
I give him a small chuckle of approval to his response. A silence came over us, with Xavier looking at his feet before making eye contact once more, his smile now twitching slightly. There was a different kind of nervousness to his features now. Not one scared of the world, but something more personal.
I do have one more question, though. Something I've been wondering since you mentioned it earlier.
Hit me with it.
Who's Marshall?
My breath immediately caught in my throat. I guess I had let his name slip when I was explaining things. Each time I thought about him, how he wasn't here next to me, my heart skipped a beat. I felt his hand rest on my shoulder and squeezed in reassurance.
You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. It's up to you.
I appreciate the support. I don't mind telling you, though. It's better to talk about things than let them simmer. I took a deep breath before starting. Marshall is my boyfriend. I last saw him the morning of the apocalypse, but there's been no sign of him since. He's out there, though. I know he is. If he weren't, I'd feel it. He's my everything, and I'll do whatever it takes to find him again, no matter the price. Xavier gives me a grin, pulling me into a side hug.
I have faith you'll find him, too.
We spent the remainder of the night in silence, the two of us just reveling in each other's company. Xavier shared some of his rations with me, not acknowledging my protest that I had enough for myself. We'd only been together a few hours today, and yet there was a sort of pull from him, one that made me feel safe. That I could open up to him about anything. That I could trust him. And trust was a scarce resource nowadays. I stood up, stretching out my back as the fire began to die down. All right, kid. We should get some rest now. We've got a big few days ahead of us. Xavier shot me a confused look at that.
What do you mean? What's happening?
Taking the emblem out of my pocket, I tossed it in his direction where he snatched it out of the air. He opened his palm, looking the symbol over.
What is it?
It's a symbol of a community that's established itself in the ruins of our world, a place where people are safe within its walls. They call themselves Haven. And tomorrow we depart. It's time to pay Haven a visit. And that's where we're going to stop. So I hope you've enjoyed this re-recording of the second episode of One Last Night. I really enjoyed this again. It's a little bit different from the ones I'm used to because it's a little bit more heavy, but it's nice. So everyone, this has been Fritz-Ay Says, and I hope you have a nice day. Ciao.